Welcome to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors. Now, the cause and effect of property markets is not really taught in any university degree. The secret sauce is not packaged up somewhere on Google, and economists don't understand it any more than garbologists, according to my next guest. According to Simon Pressley, who we're pleased to have back on the show, aside from developing a cure for cancer, he says the cause and effect of property markets is the most complicated thing on the planet, and he certainly spent all of his career trying to unpack that. Engaging the expertise of someone who deeply understands property markets is one thing, he says, but having a particular attitude towards property as an asset class is very important for those who elect to invest money in the property market further. He says good decisions are a byproduct of high quality information plus an appropriate mindset which allows the brain to function at its highest potential. Now, today we are actually talking all about mindset. And anyone that knows Simon Pressley knows that he's not known for fluff. So when he talks about mindset, he talks about getting clear on your strategy, getting clear on the noise and the stereotypes that exist within the property investing landscape and focusing on the data, the science, and the fundamentals. So I'm very pleased to welcome Simon back to the show to unpack mindset for property investing. Simon Pressley, it's a pleasure to have you back on Geared for Growth.
G'day, Mike. Thank you for having me back.
It's been a little while between drinks, but I always relish the opportunity to unpick that Rain Man brain of yours when it comes to property market analytics. And today, I was actually a bit surprised with the topic that you sort of put forward, which is about mindset. And I think anyone that knows you knows that, well, you're not a guy that engages in fluff or BS. And mindset sort of sits in that kind of self-help part of the bookstore that I don't imagine you spend a lot of time in. But however, mindset is important. And I'm looking forward to sort of unpacking that with you today. But how do you sort of define mindset and why it's important to have the right mindset as an investor?
I think mindset, it's important as having good clarity, a clear head before approaching whatever the key task is. If you think, we're having a chat off air about elite athletes, they've got all the skill in the world and they spend, years and years and years refining their craft and their athletic ability, but they're not going to perform at their best and, win the Grand Slam or break a PB in a marathon without having the clear mindset. So there'll be all sorts of mental rehearsals they'll do going into an event. And as a property investor, the event is making a decision at the end of the day. You're not running a marathon or kicking a goal. The activity is making decisions, and mindset is getting the brain giving the brain the clarity so that it can process the information to the brain's best possibility. Is, I guess, how I think of investing in mindset.
And we're going to cover off a few points that sort of relate to mindset and being a successful property investor and being able to interrogate property in the midst of all of the media noise. And a lot of that comes from economists, and you've been quite critical over your career of the media and economists. And the first point is that housing is not an index. And when you read media, when you listen to economists, they talk about, the property market. And of course they study and they know there's markets within markets and it's a big regional thing, but we still are kind of talking about medians and the property market. What's your take on that?
Yeah, well, look, it's not an index, and easily the most guilty segment of society referring to property as if it was an index is the economists. What we need to understand with property markets, there are a number of things that influence property that also influence shares. It is not an index. You cannot buy the property index, but you can buy an index on the stock market, for example. So property prices don't have these wild fluctuations that stock markets can have. I'm not saying that they always have wild fluctuations, but they do have the potential to do that. Property does not. And the reason for that is property does not change value. And nothing changes value unless the asset ownership changes hands. Now, if you have a think about shares, the value of shares can change literally within the press of a couple of keys on the keyboard, and there there are share investors all around the world that actually do that. They'll buy a parcel of shares in the morning and they'll sell them a couple of hours later, presumably at a profit. Or if they get fearful of a stock declining, they can press some keys and the asset ownership will change hands. Properties do not do that. Real estate is a much bigger asset, and the thought process and logistics behind buying and selling it is a significantly bigger gestation period. It's usually somewhere between 5 and 12 years. So not only is there no such thing as one property market, property doesn't have the wild fluctuations like an index can.
Well, I suppose, the transaction of a property is a big deal, whereas a share, it's a button and you send it off into the interwebs and it makes the trade for you. Whereas properties, it's quite a big event to actually buy or sell something. And just unpacking that to some degree, there are times where I think the property market kind of fundamentals were saying that a market should boom or it should decline, but often that doesn't actually come to pass because it relies on transactions happening. And I think we've sort of seen some evidence of that in supply and the influence of a lack of listings on the property market. So can you think of examples where that's sort of the case?
I think the best example to remind people about things changing hands is the first few months of COVID, right? So directly before, well, probably at the time when all Australians were told, ScoMo was Prime Minister at the time, and he held that infamous press conference saying, everyone must go home, your life's about to change, you can't shake hands, you've got to tap elbows, we don't know how long this will be, we've got to sort the virus out. And immediately, human brains went into fear, understandably, about the fear of the unknown with health. But for property, they went, oh, it's going to crash. That was the unknown talking. That was not, fundamentals talking. But and so then what happened is everyone's at home looking at their laptop, wondering, when can I go back to the office? How long is this going to last? And they're looking at the so-called property index and they're expecting the value of real estate all over Australia to be declining. And it didn't move. And the reason it didn't move is because we're locked up in the bloody things that need to be sold for there to be movement. There was no movement at all. First 3 or 4 months of COVID, property prices went sideways, whereas all the economists of the world were saying it's going to crash. It never happened. And then when the movement started, the property values went in the complete opposite direction to what those so-called experts said. There was the boom. Why? Because there's a lot of transactions.
And I can remember hearing, just in private discussions, you talking to your team saying, look, I know this might sort of be a little bit scary, but I'm actually going to go out publicly and say that the property market isn't going to crash to the tune of 30%, which all the banks and the economists really said. Can you remember that discussion and whether there was sort of reticence? And did you actually feel any sense of fear that like this could be an absolute calamity for my reputation and business?
No, that was the fear of my team, though, Mike. They did warn me cautiously, Simon, do not say that publicly because you'll be the only person out of 27 million in this country, and if you're wrong, we are destroyed. And I went, yeah, but I've never had more clarity about what's going to happen. But that's from years of understanding what I call the cause and effect of property markets. And I just responded to my team and said, just imagine when I am proven right in say 6 months' time, and Australian property prices are going through the roof. And we then say, yeah, well, we predicted that. Everyone's going to go, yeah, right, as if no one could predict that. There's no way in the world that I was going to do that. But the main reason for going public with it was because I recognised that within a matter of a couple of weeks, the whole nation had all this fear. But again, some of it was justifiable. None of us knew really what this health pandemic thing meant. But specific to property, I was absolutely adamant there was no need to be fearful about that. And I just felt there was an opportunity for us to demonstrate some leadership in this country and say, this is why you don't need to be worried about the value of your home or the value of investments.
Yeah, and you must be commended in the private work you did behind the scenes in speaking to people within the industry to say, look, I've looked at this. We're all going to be okay. And I know that made a meaningful difference to a lot of people. So well done to you on that. Jumping onto the second point, clarity of purpose. I mean, I kind of read that as what I see as one of the big things that's wrong with property investors is they get sucked into the hot spot. And obviously, finding these markets that are going to outperform the average is a big part of what you do. But I feel like people don't understand exactly what they're trying to achieve with property, and so they can't really reverse engineer the purchases to get to where they want to be. Is that what the purpose means to you, or something different?
Yeah, again, we're talking about decision making, and key to making any really, really good decision is to have clarity of why am I making this decision? What is the objective or the purpose of making this decision? So, for investing, the purpose is a financial outcome. So clarity of purpose, that I guess the best analogy I can think of here is if we think about shares, for example, and have a think about someone who is an employee of Commonwealth Bank, have a think of someone else who's a customer of Commonwealth Bank, and have a think of a third person who is an investor in Commonwealth Bank. Now, the staff member might be very happy as an employee of Commonwealth Bank. The customer might have a good experience, good customer service, but the intelligent share investor completely disregards how the employee feels or how the customer feels and focuses on the things that are going to influence the value, in this case, of Commonwealth Bank. Property investors need to do the same thing. Disregard where you live or whether you would live in it, because that's actually not the purpose. The purpose is a financial outcome. So get an understanding of what influences financial outcomes and focus on those things.
Mm. Do you feel that is an impediment, that people come to you, and of course you do lots of, I suppose, discovery calls or whatever you call them in your business, that the people will look at property as if like, well, I wouldn't live in that, so therefore it can't be a good investment. It can't be in demand.
Oh, it is, and that probably takes me to my fourth point. Don't see, as an investor compared to an owner-occupier, key to having a really, really good mindset is forget home. The objective has got nothing to do with home at all. The financial performance of property will have very little, if anything at all, to do with the bricks, the mortar, the kitchen, the colour scheme, the gardens, the warm weather. None of that they are not growth drivers. Mm-hmm. So property investors need to see property not as bricks and mortar, but as a financial instrument. We need to be thinking more like that share investor would about a stock market, and they're not focusing on, I bank with Commonwealth Bank, therefore I should invest in Commonwealth Bank. They're two different things. The place we live in is our home. Where we put our capital is an investment decision, and we need to have clarity around that. So always beware of the natural human tendency. I've got it, you've got it, all humans have it, to evaluate property through the lens of, would I live in that city? How would I feel living in that city? That specific property. Can I imagine myself living in that property and having a good time? None of that is a growth driver. None of that has any bearing on financial performance. They're very subjective things. Yeah, Mike lives in his home, and Mike likes his home, and I live in my home. They're very different, different cities, different properties. So disregard home. If you feel yourself consciously thinking about home-related things when you're making an investment decision, you don't have clarity of mind at all.
Mm. You know, that makes me kind of think about the human bias, as you say. I mean, when you grow up as a kid, your parents are normally friends with people similar to them, and you get a viewpoint that everybody's kind of like that. I mean, your friends, you have to have things in common. You know, at the workplace, you know, you meet different people with different perspectives, but there's got to be some sort of commonality to be employed in that sort of thing. And I can't remember the philosopher that was talking about it, but basically sort of said, you know, we view our existence in a lens of sort of like 1% of possibilities, but we form our whole worldview around it, right? And this, you know, what makes humanity special, there's all sorts of weird and wonderful people, and we might be quite weird to certain people, and they wouldn't understand why we do different things. And I guess putting yourself on top of something is a pretty narrow view that can get you into trouble.
Absolutely, yeah. It's we are all very, very different. You know, we're not robots, and properties are not a big series of Lego cities. You know, where every property is exactly the same. Every property is different. Every individual township is different in regards to its lifestyle, its climate, its attractions, its economic profiles, levels of housing affordability, volumes of housing supply. Everything's very, very different. So we need to totally disregard ourselves and what we like and what we dislike, because it has no bearing whatsoever on performance.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of places that I'm sure that you've put clients in or purchased properties yourself that have great fundamentals, but you would never live there in a million years, right?
Yeah, but there's lots of people I live in Brisbane, right? So I'm only one of 2.5 million people who live in Brisbane. So
Mm.
there's another 25 million people who don't live in Brisbane. So it doesn't matter what I like. The reality is there's like dozens and dozens of locations literally all over Australia that I could imagine myself very happily living in, but I can only live in one spot.
Yeah. Another point we were going to bring up is having the intelligence to ignore stereotypes. Now, you wrote a blog quite recently that probably was a little bit more of a inflammatory language to that, and that was just basically about the bullshit that you hear people spouting. But what are some of the big stereotypes you want to take aim at today?
Yeah, and look, the media is guilty of this all the time. Economists and lots of other occupation types are guilty of this all the time. So key to having a good mindset is to be aware of the stereotypes and to know when you're reading or you're hearing some material that's very stereotypical, because it means nothing. So the most common ones are when people are saying capital cities this, region that. I mean, that is completely useless. The 8 capital cities are all very different to each other, and the 400 individual regional townships are all very, very different to each other. So only a dumbass puts all the 8 capital cities in one big box and the other 400 regional cities in another big box and say, they're all the same. That's nonsense. Having an assumption that the size of a city's population, big city versus medium size versus small, has absolutely nothing at all to do with investment performance or indeed risk. And a lot of people will find that last statement questionable. How could a location with say 20,000 people, not be higher risk than a location with a couple of million people? Well, let me tell you, population size does not define risk. It's a stereotype. Inland versus coastal is another absolute gibberish statement that gets thrown around in the real estate media all the time when they start talking about sea change and tree change. They're emotional things, and it's Woman's Day material at the end of the day. But I'm only interested in evidence. I've studied Australian real estate history, and there is absolutely zero evidence to say that whether a location is inland or along the coast has anything at all to do with property market performance. And I guess the biggest statistic to break down all the stereotypes, if you just think about Australia's 2 biggest cities, Sydney and Melbourne, and we look at what the evidence says about the performance of their property markets over the last 20 years, that's a long period of time, Sydney and Melbourne are very much middle of the pack in terms of average annual growth rate over the last 20-year period of time. They're our 2 biggest. They're both coastal, but there's no bearing there. There's no direct link to property market performance.
That when I first read that, I thought of a stereotype that I know you've kind of unpacked in the past, and you mentioned population, but population growth is a big one that gets talked about a lot. And I can remember sitting in a room with a very clever person and them sort of saying, well, it's the most obvious thing in the world. If the population is growing, then property prices have to follow. And I sort of, I visually pictured some of those little graphics of you sort of showing these locations that had negative population growth, but the property market was outperforming areas that had 4 or 5x times the population growth. I don't think you can kind of blame people for taking that view because it seems really, really intuitive, right? But those sorts of notions are the most problematic ones because it's sort of like, well, just because it appears like it should be the case doesn't make it fact. The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
There are so many things that sound logical, and that's why people believe it, because it sounds logical. This is going to sound exceptionally arrogant, but it's not my fault that it's the truth. I'm the only person out of 27 million Australians who's actually studied Australian real estate history, Mike. That's why I know that many of these things to be myths, such as population growth is the secret source of property markets, all that sort of stuff. I know it to be a factually incorrect statement because I've taken the time, I've devoted years and years and years to study the truth in things. You know, laboratory style stuff that happens in the medical profession, for example. There is a science to the human body, isn't there? And those people have spent 7 years studying a medical degree. There is a science to property markets as well, but there's no university degree, there's no course, there's no textbook, there's no nothing where someone's actually devoted years and years and years to study cause and effect and say, well, this is the truth. And population growth is one of those things. We've written so many reports and evidence-based research documents over the years about population growth to help educate those who are interested in understanding property markets. And then an event called COVID comes along and we had zero population growth for 2 years. That's never happened in this country for more than a century. We've got to go way back to World War I when Australia's population didn't move for such a prolonged period of time. But yet that same 2-year period was the second biggest property boom in more than 200 years of Australia. That didn't surprise us. When we said at the intro, you know, why I was so confident in fronting the Australian public and saying you've got nothing to be fearful here. But a lot of that fear come from we're closing the international border down, so you can't have property prices growing if there's no population growth. Demand is not population growth, and this is where the economists of the world will probably never understand it because they don't want to understand it. Demand occurs not just for property, for anything. Demand exists when a transaction occurs. Yep. That's demand. Yep. Population growth is babies being born or overseas migrants arriving in Australia. Babies don't buy properties, and very, very few overseas migrants buy properties either. The transactions actually occur by the existing resident population. If Michael Simon bought a property today, we are competing with anyone else who wants to buy a property. That extra competition that we create by being active in the market, that's what puts pressure on asset values. So that's demand.
And this is something that I admit to taking some time to get my head around and asking you about it perhaps a number of years ago. And I think you threw back at me and probably like, because you're annoyed at answering the same question or you just wanted to cut through, you basically said like, how many times have you been born? And that's always kind of stuck with me. Can you sort of explain what you're getting at there?
Yeah, well, we're only, all of us, no matter who we are, only born once. So we only directly add to the national population figure once in our entire life. The average person now, according to the official government statistics, lives to age 85 in this country. That average person won't buy real estate until they're roughly about age 30, but they still live in homes. But by the time they die at say 85, that average person would have transacted in real estate 6 or 7 times. Let's say let's call it 6. 5 out of 6 times they transacted in real estate would have been an owner-occupied purchase. Again, this is what people don't understand. It's not about population growth. It's actually about a transaction occurring. Our lives change. Whoever's listening to this, you know, depending on how old you are, you probably would have changed homes 3 times, or in some people's cases 10, 15 times if you've moved around a heck of a lot. When you move home, if you buy the home you move into, you're creating demand. But you actually have not influenced the population figures at all unless you've moved city. If you've moved city, then you become an internal migrant, and some people do that from time to time. But it's the existing resident population, their actions in regards to real estate, how active they are as a purchaser is what demand is all about. It's not property, it's everything. So those who say surely property market performance has to be about population growth, everything that humans acquire with money, you could say that about.
Yes.
Food, fashion, technology, cars, petrol. Like, if it was true that demand is determined by population growth, then again, every single thing that humans purchase with money, there would be evidence saying, well, that's true. But it's not. There's never a direct correlation to it because it's not about population growth. It's about transaction volumes.
That's a good point. You would expect to see the population chart just absolutely mirror everything, vehicles, food, alcohol, any consumable sort of thing, but it's not the case. And I suppose the other thing about that you opened my mind to is really like the household formation. And when you are contributing to that demand, how are you doing it? Are you leaving mum and dad's? Are you a single person that's coupling up with someone to buy a house? Are you a person that's divorced and you've gone from a family home to, living by yourself? All these sorts of things have a huge impact. I remember seeing some data about just by virtue of the increase in divorces during COVID, it was something like 120,000 extra dwellings required due to that monumental shift in household formation.
Exactly. And again, that comes back to a transaction, doesn't it? Is the transaction occurring by a tenant, or is the transaction occurring because someone buying or selling property? One influences the price of rents. The movement of tenants influences the price of rent, which is largely overseas migrants. They influence more the price of rents. But if someone is buying or selling a property, that influences asset values. But our lives are forever changing. But one thing we always need is a roof over our head. So as our life changes, we require a different roof. And if we purchase that roof, we are competing with other people in the market at that time. If you've got more people looking to buy real estate than the actual number of properties available for sale, supply, people think supply is all about new construction. 95% of real estate transactions every single year have nothing to do with new construction. It's the established dwellings that tick the boxes of most people's property that they're looking to acquire, not the new build stuff. So people really do not understand property markets. I would argue that other than developing a cure for the various cancers, there's nothing more complicated than property markets. That's saying it's as simple as supply and demand. I get frustrated every time I hear as simple as supply and demand. If it was that simple, 27 million people would understand property markets, and they just don't.
Exactly. And we're going to get you back in a couple of months to unpack some of those key market drivers and influences. But I know you probably don't really want to talk about the upcoming election and the negative gearing and capital gains tax battlegrounds that we're likely to have. But I did want to unpack one of the sort of very persuasive stereotypes that I think is kind of skewing the national debate. And it's this long-held idea that if an investor sells a property, that's actually a good thing for the property markets. It's a good thing for society, because normally what happens is you get a first home buyer coming in and taking that place, and everything works in this beautiful equilibrium utopia. How would you attack that one?
I think the only people who think it's a good thing if an investor sold a property is someone who doesn't invest in real estate and has a brackish attitude, the tall poppy syndrome. That person has something that I want. How dare they? That's what I mean by a brackish attitude or a tall poppy attitude. Rather than having a positive attitude and going, that person's got something that I want. Maybe I can learn from that person. Maybe I can have a conversation with that person. I'm fine. I'd love to have what that person's got, but I find it difficult to do that. But they've done it. 2 arms, 2 legs, 24 hours in a day, 365 days a year. We've all got those resources. It's what we bloody do with them that counts, right? So if an investor sells a property, that should concern the Australian public if that's happening en masse, because that's one less property in the rental pool. And whether we like it or not, the facts are that consistently throughout the last 70 years, 3 out of every 10 Australian households, every one of those 70 years, 3 out of every 10 households have depended upon rental accommodation. We know that governments don't fund rental accommodation. They're flat out funding infrastructure and basic healthcare needs, let alone providing rental accommodation. It's the Australian resident population that has always funded the rental pool. So if you've got en masse lots of people selling as a landlord, the country needs to take a look at that and go, why? What have we done to make it less attractive? Because if too many people do that, the rental pool is going to shrink. So those tenants that depend on it have fewer choices, and invariably that will then put upward pressure on the price to rent.
Well, I think we're living through that at the moment. I mean, rents are sort of moderating, but I remember Peter Kalisos conducting some research over, I think it was a 25-year period, saying that rents have underperformed inflation, and probably still even the case with the recent rise in the last couple of years. But of course, we've seen quite an exodus of landlords in the last little while now, whether it be profit taking, which is certainly there. But I think, like, if you look at things like the PIPA survey, it's intervention at the state level, the different minimum standards or no cause evictions or land tax and those sorts of things. But what have we seen with that? Well, we've seen a historically tight vacancy rate, right? And the like, everyone can kind of debate and take their position, but it's actually a very serious human story, because the net result is homelessness. And I know that that's something that that you think about and you're cognizant about.
Yeah, absolutely. But again, history leaves footprints, Mike. When I've studied Australian real estate history, the ugly environment that we've been living through the last sort of 5 or 6 years in regards to the rental environment I'm referring to there, Australia's been through that before. For the sort of back half of the 50s, the entire 1960s decade and into the 70s, vacancy rates were incredibly low. There was upward pressure on rent. The homeless rates were through the roof, and the cause of all that is the same things that have caused this current rental problem. It's not one decision. It's not something that happened overnight. It's not COVID related. It's got nothing at all to do with COVID. It's a series of really poor policies at federal, state, and local level over a period of now approaching 10 years. But if you don't create a supportive environment for those who supply rental accommodation, that's what a landlord is, that's what a property investor is. They are a rental supplier. So if you do not provide a supportive environment for rental suppliers, you cannot expect to have enough supply of rental accommodation. That's logical.
Yeah, absolutely. And all this supply, we're only really talking about new construction, but that is just one part of it. And new construction's difficult right now for a lot of different reasons, but that's another episode. And I did intend to keep the soapbox in the cupboard, but sorry, I did have to bring it out for a minute. But let's jump back on script. Another point you wanted to make is about sensible deployment of investment capital and cash flow. What are we talking about there?
Again, it's thinking about what is this? It's about mindset. It's about decision making. What constitutes a good decision when it comes to investing in property? And there's lots of components that collectively add up to whether we've made a good decision or not. But we're not actually buying, and I think that's what a lot of unintentionally the decision process for a lot of investors. They're going through a process of buying a property. We're actually thinking about, no, that's actually the thing I own, but it's not the purpose of what I'm trying to do. So deployment of capital and how that influences cash flow is related to the whole objective of the exercise, a financial decision, a financial outcome. So, for example, a $1 million property that grew by 20%, that's great. And think of another property that was worth 500 grand that grew by 30%. Now, 20% of 1 million is 200 grand, yeah? 30% of 500,000 is $150,000. So 150,000 is less than 200. People will focus on I made $200,000 worth of growth. That's more than 150. Yeah, it is. But what was the better decision? The better decision was the asset that grew by 30%. That's what people should be focusing on. So a smarter decision would be to say, I've got $1 million, and using that example I've given there, to bought two properties for $500,000 each that grew by 30%. We've then made $300,000 as opposed to the person who's put capital into one asset worth $1 million and it's grown by 20% or 200,000. There's a lot of numbers there, but hopefully that makes sense. Deploying your capital in a responsible way is something that the intelligent share investor does. Could you imagine a share investor who is just about to start putting their share portfolio together? They've got $100,000 cash, and they put that $100,000 into one stock on the stock market. I mean, no sensible person would do that, right?
Yeah.
Why? Because nothing always goes well. So there might be a couple of stocks they're really excited about. So sure, they'll buy some shares in those, but they're going to spread their capital not only across multiple companies in the stock exchange, but also multiple industries. Property investors need to think like that as well. When I said earlier, you need to forget the bricks and the mortar and think more about the financial instrument. This is a mathematical example of what I'm talking about. So spreading your capital across multiple assets in multiple cities, across multiple states, is the most responsible way to minimize your risk. If someone drops the basket of eggs, at least you can still make an omelette because you haven't dropped all the baskets that have got eggs in them. It's also safer for the cash flow. The cash flow on that one property that someone paid $1 million for is much harsher on the household budget than someone who's spent $1 million for two properties. The combined rental income for the two properties and the expenses, you're going to have a much smaller loss in the household budget than the person who's put all their capital into that one expensive property.
Yeah, and I suppose when you're sort of spreading that out, you think about a potential vacancy. Now, it maybe sounds a bit silly to talk about vacancies when we're at 1.2% vacancy rate, but it won't stay like that forever, hopefully. But having that one asset vacant compared to two that can kind of offset each other, that's a consideration for cash flow as well, right?
Absolutely. Now, what I'm not saying is it's a good decision just because something's cheap. I'm not saying that. As I said earlier, there are lots of components that collectively will determine whether we've made the very best decision possible. But just the generics and understanding the concept of not putting too much capital into any one asset is the moral of the story here for mindset.
Yeah, I suppose you can get ridiculous with it. I mean, you're not going to recommend someone that has $1 million to try and find $100,000 places in the middle of nowhere, right? But,
Correct.
when you look at it sensibly, if it's a quality asset and you can diversify rather than putting all your eggs in one basket, then that's what we're talking about.
Absolutely, yep.
Now, this next point is a really tricky one because I suppose when I was younger, I kind of thought anyone that wrote a book or was on the telly or was in the newspaper just must be an expert. There must be some system to certify that you only get in that position because of X, Y, Z. But sometimes the loudest voices are the easiest ones to hear. Sometimes you can buy your way into certain positions. And I think it's easy for people within the industry to sort of look at a consumer and go, why would you do that? And why would you use that particular person? But it's very, very hard to find experts. What would be your advice for people that just feel a little bit like a deer in the headlights?
Yeah. Again, part of having a good mindset, and this will be frustrating for everybody to hear this next statement, but you need to accept, albeit with a lot of reluctance, you need to accept that 90% of everything that you read and you hear every single day about property markets will be utter rubbish. Utter rubbish. A lot of the people making the statements will be well-meaning, but very, very rarely will there be any evidence associated with whatever statements or opinions they've expressed. Property market opinions are like toenails and assholes, like everyone's got one, right? But just because someone's got some letters after their name or a fancy title, a high profile, 1 million followers, look wise because they've got grey hair, whatever, that doesn't mean that they are truly skilled in the field of assessing property market performance. Now, that's really, really hard for a property investor who's doing their very, very best to acquire good knowledge, but you just need to, again, reluctantly accept and have your wits about you that 90% that's published every single day in social media forums and in all sorts of big profile banners, you're reading rubbish. We rattled off some of the common stereotypes before. If someone wants to know, well, how do I know whether I read some rubbish? Just ingrain in your brain those stereotypes. Population growth, big cities, inland, coastal, warm weather, cold weather. Whenever you're consuming information that's talking that fluff, that's the easiest way to go, well, that person clearly is not really, really skillful in this space, because I know that stuff is rubbish. So everything else that comes out of that person's mouth, you should be questioning the quality of that information.
And we're talking a big ticket purchase, right? Like an investment property might be the most expensive thing you ever buy, or the second most after your principal place of residence. But in some respects, it's even more important because your principal place of residence is not necessarily part of your financial future and your financial goals. I mean, you can definitely do well with it. It's got the capital gains tax exemption, so I think it's kind of like an underthought of way of wealth creation. But it's the flow-on effect of that first investment that hopefully gets you into the next couple. And people, I feel like sometimes spend a bit more time researching their next flat screen TV or their robot vacuum cleaner. You've got to put the work in to understand that this is the right person for the job, right?
Absolutely. I laugh when someone says to me, "I'd do this myself, but I don't have the time." I don't want to embarrass them and say, even if you had the time, you wouldn't. Where would you start with this? Because as I said earlier, there's no university degree that you can do this. The most valuable use of someone's time is to actually take as long as required to work out the true credentials of the experts. Do that. And then whatever you decide, whoever you feel has the best credentials as a property market expert, align yourselves with them. And that's the best way of, there's no guarantees in life, but that's the best way of giving yourself the best chance. Don't think you can do it yourself, but certainly make sure that you don't get lured into assuming that all these people who are reported to be experts are experts. I promise you, when you look at their track records and what they do day in, day out, very few of these people actually buy property. There's no accountability to themselves for their own statements. It doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong. They don't buy anything. Most of them are highly risk averse. They're too fearful of doing anything. So they've got no scar tissue. They've made no decisions of their own. They've got no personal experiences to draw on. They haven't experienced adversity. Adversity is very important for learning and development in all walks of life, not just as a property investor. We don't seek out adversity, but it's the best teacher. You can't get that from Google or a university degree. But I mean, the most successful people in all walks of life have had more failures than someone else. And that's had a big contribution as to why they've become so successful, because they've learned from those experiences.
Well, I've certainly learnt from this interview today, and if this was a self-help book, it's nowhere near esoteric enough to be a bestseller, because it's full of facts and gold information, and I want to say thanks for sharing all of that with our listeners today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Mike.
Cheers, Simon. See you next time.